This week on Q&A, journalist and professor Mark Danner. He talks about his career and his latest book, Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War, about the U.S. war on terrorism.
Mark Danner, your book Spiral means what?
Spiral is a figure that talks about a motion beginning at the center, going around and around, and getting ever farther away from the original center and from the direction you're trying to go. So it was, to me, this image of spiral, circling, never getting closer to the point, characterized very well our war on terror. That it was intended to, like all wars, end itself, somehow finish the job at hand, end the violence. And in fact, it's continued and continued and continued, endlessly circling itself on and on. So that figure occurred to me, and I thought it was a rather vivid representation of what we've been doing for the last now 15 years.
How many wars have you actually seen up close?
That's a good question. I wrote about Central American wars, but I was there afterwards. I covered the Bosnian War, the Balkan Wars, which was actually really several wars, and the political violence in Haiti, which was never actually a war, although it was a fascinating series of coups d'etats, revolutions, and so on. And then the Iraq War, which itself was kind of several different wars. So I don't know what that number would be, 3, 4? Depending what you consider wars and whatnot.
And if it's a simple question, what is your attitude about war?
Well, for my last book, which was called Stripping Bare the Body, I based that title on a quotation by a Haitian politician, fascinating man, who said, "Political violence is like stripping bare the body. The better to remove the clothing to place the stethoscope directly on the skin." In other words, political violence, including war, is a way, it seems to me, to see a society with clarity, to strip away the outside layers and see the various constituents of a society struggling with one another. So I've always found it a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, it's, on the one hand, there's the sheer excitement of it, the adrenaline-pumping excitement of following a violent series of events, the end of which you simply don't know. And then there's what it shows about the society you're trying to understand. It shows people in extremis, it shows institutions in extremis, it shows, in general, people and other phenomena under stress. And that's, I think, true of the U.S. in the war on terror as well, that a lot has been exposed about this country that we perhaps would not have thought before was true, and it happens during wartime. So I think, apart from the visceral excitement itself, it lets you see inside of things in a way that only a crisis can.
Let me ask you a series of questions about war. If you were an aide to Woodrow Wilson before World War I, and he said, "Mark, what should I do?" what would you have told him?
Boy, that's a wonderful question. I'd like to say, to think I would have said, "Mr. President, even though it doesn't seem so at the moment, our interests and the interests of the American people are directly involved in what happens in Europe. And the United States will have the greater degree of leverage at the beginning, before things get very bad. And we should intervene. It's very much against our interests to have a grinding, terrible war on the continent. The best way, indeed, for us to stay out is to try to prevent this conflict and do everything we can to prevent it." But I fear that I would not have had that kind of perceptiveness. You know, I would have thought the same thing at the beginning of the Balkan Wars of the 90s. But at the beginning of those wars, I was firmly against the United States intervening. I didn't think it was our war. I didn't think it was really engaged our national interest, which is pretty much what Wilson thought when he became president. So I think it's the great challenge of a statesman is to be far-seeing enough that you can see the country's interests at a time when they can be responsibly supported with a minimum amount of expenditure of blood and treasure. And Wilson was not in that position. His aides didn't tell him that clearly at the beginning of the First World War. FDR, I think, saw it fairly clearly at the beginning of the Second, but it's mainly because of his experience as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under and Secretary of the Navy under Wilson. So how do you get to the point of being far-seeing enough? I mean, similarly with Syria, the present conflict in Syria, I think perhaps possibly President Obama might have made different decisions if he had seen how it has evolved. He wouldn't admit that, I don't think, but it's possible.
Well, let me go to FDR. If you'd have been an aide to FDR in 1940, what would you have told him when Winston Churchill kept saying, "We need you in this, we need you in this"?
I think FDR essentially had it right. His perception was Churchill was right, that the United States was inevitably going to be drawn into this conflict, but that the American public, politically speaking, wasn't ready for it to happen yet. So he had to take interim measures, some of which may well have been unconstitutional, to keep the United States, to reinstitute the draft, to do various things with the destroyers, the other things that he did, to keep the United States in a position of influence, and so it would be ready when the time came. And of course then the Japanese, not only the Japanese in their attack, but Hitler in declaring war, which was a remarkable thing. He didn't need to declare war on the United States, but he did, took the matter out of his hands. But I think he actually, within the bounds of the politics of his time, carried things off pretty well. And I think he very much knew what he was doing, that the American public wasn't ready for another overseas engagement. And the only thing that made them ready was this clear and present danger that the Japanese attack represented.
If you were an aide to Lyndon Johnson, now I know we skipped over Korea, but if you're an aide to Lyndon Johnson, he ran in '64, implied that we weren't going to send American boys to fight in Vietnam, even though we had some there. What would you have told him?
I would have told him, Mr. President, if you don't believe you can win, if you don't believe that this is a winning prospect, you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't fear the political repercussions of not getting more deeply involved and of withdrawing. This is not the loss of China, which is what really haunted Johnson. He said to Richard Russell in a phone call that was tape recorded, they'd impeach a president who ran out of there, wouldn't they? This was '65. And even though he was always pessimistic about what the results would be in Vietnam, he never thought the U.S. would win, nor did his aides. He still got involved. And I think that's the first thing I would have said, that you don't have to do this. The political damage of withdrawal, the handful of advisors we have, will not be as great as you think. It's not the loss of China. But if you do it, if you do get involved, the key thing is a political task, which you know better than anyone, which is to get the American people involved, to get them on board, to persuade them of the importance of this issue, the reason why it's so important to send American young men to go and fight. And of course, Johnson did not do that. He announced the escalation in '65, in mid-'65, at the end of a press conference. He never gave a sober speech talking about the importance of Vietnam and so on until we were very much involved. So I think I would have said, don't do it if you don't want to do it. But if you're going to do it, you'd better build the political support, because it's going to be a long struggle. And, the amazing thing, there's a great book by Kai Bird called Color of Truth about the Bundy brothers. And one of the remarkable facts that emerges from it is really that nobody was an optimist about the war at the top of the administration. I mean, they weren't dyed-in-the-wool pessimists, but nobody thought that this would be a quick engagement, would be easy to win. They couldn't conceive of defeat, that the United States would be defeated, but they weren't optimists. And I think the reasons Johnson got involved at the end of the day had to do with the difficulty of withdrawal. That is, it was easier to go forward than it was to go back. And I think that's part of the tragedy.
Did you ever face the draft?
I didn't. I was born in 1958.
What would you have done had you been drafted, do you think?
Boy, I don't know. I honestly don't know. You know, when I think about the sort of role I played in college and where I was on the spectrum, I probably would have been involved in the anti-war movement, depending what year it was and so on. So I think it's likely I would have either gone to jail or I'd like to think I wouldn't have gone abroad or anything, but I think I might have gone to jail. But maybe I would have gone and fought. I honestly don't know. When I was in college, the war that was going on was the Salvador War. And I was very interested in that. I did a paper for Stanley Hoffman about, you know, the roots of the war and so on. And I thought the U.S. shouldn't be involved in that. That was kind of the after-war, after Vietnam, in a funny way, even though it was much, farther away in time. But boy, that's a good question. I honestly don't know. I remember as a child, as I then was, my father saying, you know, we shouldn't be there, but if we're going to be there, we ought to win, you know, and get out. I think a lot of people thought that. You know, what are we doing there? But there wasn't, military force is one of the things I think the American public very often gets impatient about it, because they really believe they have this trump card, this great military that can defeat anyone. But it's not true. It is an extraordinary military. It's very powerful, but it can only win in certain situations, and it can only really destroy things. It can't build a new order in its place. So I think we demand of our military a lot of things that the military can't really accomplish, and we get very frustrated when it doesn't.
Now we do a kind of a nasty thing here from time to time, and that is show video from years ago.
Okay.
Your first appearance on C-SPAN was in 1985 on a call-in show. And I want to show you the Mark Danner of 1985, 31 years ago.
Oh, boy.
Well, what I'm worried about right now is other countries that are coming of age in the nuclear weapon-free area that aren't negotiating with one another and could possibly. Terrorism, for instance, is great today, huh? And what about them guys?
We have done a lot better than anyone could have thought in limiting the number of nations that have nuclear weapons. I think it was President Kennedy who said in 1963 that by this time, or by 1980, that there would be 20 nations that had nuclear arsenals. That hasn't happened. There are now 7 or 8. But there are bound to be more, and we just have to do our best to limit them.
Well, thank you for that.
What's the update, though, on 31 years ago on nuclear weaponry?
Oh, my.
What's happened, in your opinion, that how's it changed?
You know, that was during the mid-'80s when there was this enormous amount of attention to the nuclear issue, in part because Ronald Reagan had gotten into office and had given these speeches about the evil empire and so on. There was the nuclear freeze movement, so there was strong popular fear and interest in the nuclear issue. And it's remarkable now to me, you know, having grown up with this prospect of nuclear weapons and nuclear attack as very real during the Cold War, how they've receded as an issue. I think President Obama, to go back to your question, has done pretty well on his beginning, at least, when he got into office and signed a START II agreement, which pretty dramatically limited nuclear weapons. He made a speech in Prague in which he suggested that the goal was elimination. He hasn't made much progress along that line. I would have hoped there would have been another treaty by now, and he hasn't. In fact, they're embarking on a pretty extremely expensive path to modernize nuclear weapons, which I frankly think is the wrong way to go. It seems to me that they should be limiting them more. They should be eliminating one leg of the triad, the land-based leg of the triad, which is the most destabilizing, should go. They should just get rid of them. We should just have submarines and bombers, I think, and the numbers should continue to go down until you reach a kind of stability in the mid-hundreds or so. But the interesting thing is that this is not a vivid issue. You can have a presidential candidate who doesn't even know what the triad is, and to think this would have been impossible 15 years ago, or certainly 30 years ago. So we continue to live with them as if the threat is gone. The other thing that I wish Obama had accomplished was a policy of no first use, which McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara and other writers, George Kennan, called for in the mid-'80s, and would have said, we will only use nuclear weapons if they are first used against us. And that is not the U.S. policy now. U.S. policy remains that in certain situations, after a conventional attack, the U.S. would respond with nuclear weapons, which I think is the wrong policy.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Utica, New York, in northern New York State.
And your parents did what?
My father was a dentist, general practitioner dentist. My mother was my mother is still with us, thank goodness, and she was a school teacher. She taught Spanish, and both parents were huge readers. We went to the library most evenings to take out books, and it was a very happy time of my life, happy upbringing.
What was their politics?
I'd say they were both Democrats. My father was more of an FDR Democrat. His favorite president, though, was Truman. And I'd say he got considerably more conservative as he got older. He was a big hunter, and the First Amendment issue, I think, tended to make him more conservative. My mother remains a kind of FDR Democrat, I would say.
Brothers and sisters?
Grew up with 3 sisters. I now have a sister who is a court reporter in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Second sister was the news director of a radio station for a long time in Jackson, Wyoming. So the family has kind of moved to the west. I partly live in California now too.
How much of a pacifist are you?
I think I'm not really I wouldn't describe myself as a pacifist. I think I'd probably call myself more of a realist, meaning I think that U.S. power should be used fairly abstemiously. And when I say U.S. power, I mean military power, to protect the country. I think very often we get our motives crossed, and we attempt, as I said a few minutes ago, to use military power in ways that it isn't effective. So I wouldn't call myself a pacifist. I became, covering the Balkan Wars, I was certainly an interventionist when it came to Bosnia. I thought that siege of Sarajevo should be lifted, and the U.S. had the American air power to do it. And this was this critical moment in American history after the Cold War, when the question was, what do you do with this? What are U.S. responsibilities around the world? If a genocide is going on, does the United States have a responsibility to do something about it, or does the U.S. simply act when its vital interests are somehow affected? And I guess when it comes to that question, a realist would say only vital interests. And when it came to the question of involvement in Bosnia, I really believed that we had to do something because of the mass killing going on.
If you were working for Jerry Ford you'd be working for, Jerry Ford and maybe Jimmy Carter, and the Pol Pot, 2 million people slaughtered in Cambodia was an issue, and we just finished the Vietnam War in '75 and all that, and Jerry Ford said to you or Jimmy Carter, what should I do?
Boy, that's a really hard question. They're practical matters. You have to look at first. I think when you look at that particular genocide, because that's really what it was, the fact is the U.S. had reports of a lot of killing, but the country itself was isolated. You only had a few people getting out, very few. We knew horrible things were going on. I don't think we knew about the scale of the destruction by any means. I think I would have probably told the president that we should be denouncing what's going on. We should not recognize them at the UN. We should, we should direct the moral opprobrium of the globe against this particular regime. I don't know that that regime, the problem could have been solved with military force at the time. Certainly there was no domestic support to do that. Eventually the Vietnamese, of course, invaded and they ended it. And it's a shame of the United States that when the Vietnamese did that, we continued to recognize diplomatically the Pol Pot government, which is completely horrible. But I think that's one of those situations where there wasn't a good option. I think politically speaking, there was no military option. You would have had to, I mean, I don't know what you could have done militarily apart from bomb, which of course we had done a great deal of already, which helped cause the installation, the victory of the Khmer Rouge. So, boy, that's a very hard question.
If you worked for George Herbert Walker Bush and the original Desert Shield, all that business, and Kuwait was invaded by Saddam Hussein, and he said, Mark Danner, what should I do?
Well, I'm actually on record about that. I was a writer at the New Yorker then, a staff writer, and I did their comments, a series of comments at the front of the magazine, which are their editorials, and they were unsigned at the time. I think most of them were unsigned anyway. And my view was that Bush's initial instinct, which was to levy very heavy sanctions, and in effect a boycott, which was, by the way, Wilson's original idea, Woodrow Wilson's, who we started with, I thought that was the way to go. I thought this is, okay, here we are, we're in the post-Cold War world. This is the first major conflict. We have this first major conflict with a country that relies for its entire life on one export, oil. If we can stop that oil, we can non-violently strangle the country and force them, if we have a little bit of patience, to withdraw from Kuwait. And that was really my position, that they used military force much earlier than they needed to. Now, in the event, of course, as always, it depends on how long your view is. But in the immediate term, it was a highly successful war. In the longer term, it left Saddam in power and led to the second Iraq war. But I think it would have been, I mean, imagine if 6 or 8 months later, they actually withdrew without a war. I think that would have been a huge victory for the international system and for what George H.W. Bush had called the New World Order. I mean, that was Wilson's vision. Wilson's vision was boycott. You don't always need to fight. We can get this international organization that can boycott an evildoer, that can boycott an aggressor, and can choke off the lifeblood and cause the end of the regime or whatever, without necessarily resorting to warfare. And I think that would have been a remarkable opportunity to do that, but he didn't take it.
Had you worked for Bill Clinton and when he was president, and he said, Rwanda looks bad right now, and they're going to slaughter each other, what should we have done there?
I would have, again, there are a few practical concerns that were difficult at the time, which Samantha Power describes in her Problem from Hell, History of Genocide, which is that it happened very quickly, 75 days, very quickly. But in fact, the U.S. not only didn't intervene, we prevented the Canadians from intervening. We essentially prevented anyone else from intervening. And I would have acted differently. I think I would have intervened. Probably with a special forces force, a relatively small number of troops taking control of the capital. Again, it's only a superpower that doesn't do something like that because of Somalia. Somalia has nothing to do with Rwanda, but because the United States had the Black Hawk Down incident, no one wanted to get involved in Rwanda. But I would have intervened in that instance, and you would have saved hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, 750,000 is the conventional number now that are thought to have died. And even though it happened very quickly, I think if you had gotten in with Special Forces or 82nd Airborne, you wouldn't have had to occupy the entire country. I mean, the military would have hated it. The military hates missions like this because, what's the exit strategy? What are we doing? But I think that's a good example of a situation where the United States was bound to act to prevent huge loss of life.
When is it worth losing American lives?
Again, a very difficult question. I think, if you're using the military at all in a situation of violence like that, like Rwanda, the president has to be in the position to say, this is worth losing American lives, because American lives are certainly going to be lost. I don't think very many. I think the U.S. probably would have been able to get control of that situation quite quickly. But I think you have to be willing to say that this is worth the expenditure of American lives. I think in general, you want the answer to that question to be, in the great majority of cases, only when U.S. vital interests are at stake. But the problem with that is, and that's the realist, kind of litany, catechism, but the problem with that is you can have disagreements about vital interests, and vital interests very often are tied up with other things. I mean, even George H.W. Bush, right? He's our great realist president before Obama. When he intervened in Iraq, he didn't say oil, even though his Secretary of State, James Baker, said jobs, jobs, jobs. George H.W. Bush said, this man is worse than Hitler. This aggression will not stand. He stood on international principle. So I think that was a good example of a case that had both realist side, which is oil and the stability of the Middle East, the stopping of aggression, and to some degree an idealistic side as well. Although, as I said, I think it would have been much better to wait a little while and see if we could have accomplished it without going to war, which I think was possible.
As you well know, you were at Harper's for a while. You wrote for the New York, you still do write for the New York Review of Books, I assume, from time to time. You were at the New York Times Magazine. When did you decide to start teaching, and where do you teach, and what do you teach?
I was involved actually in writing pieces about the Bosnian War, the Balkan War, and I had just gotten back from Bosnia. I was at Fort Wayne, Indiana, where my girlfriend then lived. She'd grown up in Fort Wayne, and I was writing pieces there, and one day the phone rang, and it was Orville Schell, the China specialist and writer and New Yorker writer, who I knew from the New Yorker, didn't know very well, who had been named the dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley. And he just called me out of the blue and said, I'd like you to come teach here. And I essentially said, well, I'm not that interested in that. I don't want to teach. I'm in the middle of this book. I'm writing on Bosnia. And I put the phone down, and Catherine, my then girlfriend, was walking by the room at the time. She just happened to be walking by, and she said, who's that? And I explained the phone call to her, and she said, are you crazy? You'd be a great teacher. Why don't you just try it? We'll go out to Berkeley. It'll be wonderful. And that was really why I ended up going. And I taught, my first class was a seminar called Wars, Coups, and Revolutions. And it was really about writing about violent political change. And it's an amazing thing. You sit down, you've spent the last 20 odd years writing about various things, traveling around, and you don't really think you know much, frankly. I mean, it's not as if you've gotten a law degree or something. You've just been traveling around writing, and then you sit down, you've got a table of these very smart Berkeley students around, and you start to talk, and you suddenly realize, actually, I know a lot about this subject. I've been covering it for a long time. And I was amazed, really, about how much I enjoyed teaching, that there's really nothing. I mean, a lot of writers teach to earn a living and for other reasons, but there is really nothing like a seminar that really starts to hum, in which people are arguing, people are taking issue. For example, this issue of idealism and realism, why we intervene. You get 12 smart Berkeley undergraduates or Berkeley graduate students sitting around a table who've read 8 of the same books over the last 8 weeks about intervention. You can really learn something. So I think the thing I like most about teaching is I find myself learning immense amounts all the time. And I teach both at University of California at Berkeley and at Bard College, where I am this fall. And in both places I usually give one course on politics. This semester the course on politics is called Seeing the Twilight War. It's about our ongoing war on terror. That's one seminar. And the other one is called Writing Darkness, Narratives of Captivity, which is about the writing that's come out of prison camps, concentration camps, the lager, narrative of slave, of Frederick Douglass's narrative, for example, Dostoevsky, Shalamov. We just did Primo Levi on survival in Auschwitz. And we'll go right ahead through Jean Genet and Jacobo Timmerman about Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number in Argentina. So it's about the kind of literature that's come out of prisons and cells and what has been produced in those kinds of conditions of captivity. And the reason I'm giving that course is just because I've been interested in it. And what a wonderful thing to be paid to gather, a dozen smart 20-year-olds around, all read the same thing and debate it. I've given classes at Berkeley with my friend, the poet Bob Hass. We gave a seminar on Dostoevsky. We gave one on Tolstoy, one on Chekhov. I've just had a wonderful time. I love to teach.
Bard's located where?
Bard is in Annandale on Hudson, which is Hudson River Valley, as that implies, near Rhinebeck, Rhinecliff, that area. It's where Washington Irving's stories take place.
Okay, you're now an aide to George W. Bush, and it's in 2001.
I knew we were getting to this place.
Yes, 9/11. He says, Mark Danner, what should I do? September 11th, 2001 happens.
I would have said, Mr. President, this has been a huge shock. Everybody who works for you, everybody who supports you, understands what a shock this has been. 3,000 Americans have never been killed in an attack on our soil before. We all feel great pain about it. We feel guilt that we let it happen. But the important thing now is to respond intelligently, to respond in a way that's going to limit the chance of our being attacked again, and secondarily, but very importantly, is going to limit the number of jihadists there are in the world. What we don't want to do is respond in such a way that will produce more of these militants, more of these militant organizations. They want us to overreact. They want us to occupy Muslim countries so they can build their recruitment. They want us to torture people. They want us to do things that's going to allow them to make their case against us. What we have to do is treat them like they are. There are 1,000 ragged militants in the mountains of Afghanistan. We have to go in and get them. We have to destroy that organization. We can do it with our special forces. We can do it with our highly trained troops. We can do it with some limited use of air power, but we have to be discreet. We have to be directed. We have to go against our enemies in such a way that we kill the minimum number of civilians, that we give them the minimum case to make against us. Because what they want to do, and it's on record, Mr. President, is they want to get us to occupy Afghanistan and have that become a quagmire where they can destroy us as they destroyed the Soviet Union before us. And so we need to have a discreet, lethal response. And we need at the same time to strengthen our relationships with Muslim countries, moderate Muslim countries. We have to realize that our enemy is extremism, is extreme jihadism. We have to make sure that it isn't perceived that we're attacking the Muslim world, that we're attacking everyday Arabs. We have to do everything we can both to destroy our enemy and to prevent it from growing, because the wrong response will help them. And they have attacked us to elicit precisely that wrong response. They have it in their minds that they are provoking us. This is the strategy of provocation, and we have to keep in our mind what they want us to do and not do it. That's what I would say.
Did you write that before the war started?
No, I didn't, although I did do a piece for the Times op-ed page that said a little of that our response has to be discreet, or it wasn't quite as fully formed, and certainly some of what I said is enriched by Monday morning quarterbacking. There's no doubt about it. But I said a little of it in the Times, definitely.
There's a lot we can talk about there, but I want to move to President Obama, whose time is almost up in the White House. This is from January the 22nd, 2 days after he was inaugurated, 2009. I want your reaction. It's only 30 seconds.
Okay.
We are not, as I said in the inauguration, going to continue with a false choice between our safety and our ideals. We think that it is precisely our ideals that give us the strength and the moral high ground to be able to effectively deal with the unthinking violence that you see emanating from terrorist organizations around the world. We intend to win this fight. We're going to win it on our terms.
Well, it's very eloquent. That was the point, his second full day in office, in which he signed a number of presidential orders, including prohibiting torture, ordering that Guantanamo would be closed within a year, and ordering a study of interrogation techniques, among other things. So that was a signal moment. I remember vividly watching that live, probably on C-SPAN actually, and thinking, my God, he's really doing this, and he's giving it the kind of prominence it deserves. I think that that was an extremely important moment, but it's important for what it does, what it did at the time, but it's also important to look back on it and realize that a lot of the things he was pointing to, he didn't really achieve in the event. I mean, Guantanamo is one example, at least the difficulties of Guantanamo, put it that way, that Congress has reacted against him, or did react against him when it came to closing Guantanamo, and would not give him a free hand in the opening days and years of his administration. There is also the fact that he prohibited torture, which, as I describe in Spiral, is a very strange word. Could the president, one should think for a minute, prohibit murder? The president couldn't prohibit murder. Why? Because murder is against the law. Congress has prohibited murder. Similarly, torture is against the law. Congress has prohibited torture. Title 18. It's against the law already. And when the president prohibits torture, it tells you something. It tells you that it's gone from an issue of law to an issue of policy. When Mitt Romney was running in 2012, it was leaked in October of 2012 that he, if inaugurated, would reinstitute enhanced interrogation techniques. In the 2016 campaign, there's been a lot of talk about torture, of course, and reinstituting torture. So I think one of the changes that's happened in our country since 9/11 is that torture went from being an anathema, something that was cursed and illegal, to being a policy choice. And he was not able to change that. You could ask how he could have changed it. Establishing a truth commission, perhaps, having some kind of official condemnation of what had happened. He could have gone a different route. But I think during the war on terror, as he still was and as we still are, that was politically extremely difficult and perhaps impossible. So that clip, I think, is, I feel moved watching it, because it was a critical moment in American history. That moment, George W. Bush's moment in 2006 when he gave a speech from the White House about torture, critical moment in American history. And I look at that and I think he wanted to do much of what I wrote about in that book, I think. There's a significant part of President Obama that wanted to end the war on terror. He said it several times. This war must end. This war, like all wars, must come to an end. But he found himself unable to do it, not only because of the actions of our enemies, but because of the actions of our government itself and the policy that had preceded him.
Why did you use this quote on the front page of part 2 of your book, Obama, Normalizing the Exception? Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine. September the 30th, 2011, Barack Obama.
Yeah, President Obama said that during a meeting. It's quoted in Dan Kledman's book, I believe, and he was talking about the drone program. The drone program in which people, mostly on the other side of the world, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, are killed remotely using these unmanned vehicles. has been the signal expansion of his presidency. It was used under George W. Bush, but not extensively. Under Obama's presidency, the United States has probably, the numbers certainly are in the thousands. It's probably killed 4,000 people, something like that, using drones. And I think he was, the question is why I used that as a quotation, because I think his own position with respect to the war and the policies he has implemented when it comes to the war is a somewhat ironic one. He thinks, he gave a speech at the National Defense University in which he essentially said, you know, we cannot be in a state of perpetual war. We have to end this war. And you watch this and you think, and it was a very eloquent speech, and you think, well, you're the president. Why can't you end it? And I think there's a certain irony, a certain sad irony in what he says about some of his policies. I think there's an irony in the fact that you know, he'll be leaving office with troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Excuse me. And I think that statement, it turns out I was pretty good at killing people, is part of that irony. Like, who would have thought this? And he feels himself, I think he felt himself forced into it, that he, excuse me, he got into office, he wanted to end the big wars, end the Iraq War and the Afghan War, even though he expanded it when he first entered office. But his goal was to end the big shooting wars and develop what we now can call, and what I call in the book, the light footprint, which is the use of drones, the use of special forces operatives on raids, and this kind of steady low-level war that's going on in a half dozen countries around the world that the United States is prosecuting, and that doesn't get a lot of headlines. It's not a big political issue. You know, it's not something you campaign on, but it is going on, and it's very relevant, it seems to me, to our national discussion. And it's relevant when you talk about him, because I don't think he would have predicted he would be in this position at the end of his presidency.
One of the footnotes in your book suggests that Osama bin Laden wanted to bring this country to bankruptcy.
Yeah.
First of all, should we have killed Osama bin Laden as a country, and that was President Obama? And if you were Osama bin Laden and you were alive, would you feel like you accomplished what you wanted?
Well, the answer to the first question, I think, is yes. I think I don't particularly like the phrase "we brought him to justice," because I think when you bring somebody to justice in the American system, you try them and so on. So I don't particularly like hearing it described that way. But I think under the circumstances, the raid which killed him was justified. I think there would have been advantages to capturing him, but I don't think it was possible, and I don't think the SEALs that was part of their mission. I think they were going there to kill him. So yeah, I think that was justified. The second part of the question?
Well, I'm going to ask you another one. Is similar to
the one you just asked was interesting, but I'm kind of lost. I kind of lost it.
But in the interim, let me ask you this, and I'll try to think of it.
We'll both try.
What grade does President Obama deserve, based on what he promised he would do when it came to wars and all that? What kind of a grade would you give him after 8 years? From your perspective?
Yeah, I'd say C+, maybe. I'd say things developed in a way he didn't expect. I think that, you know, my view is it would have been very much in American interest to limit this war, and that there is a self-perpetuating quality to it. We've essentially adopted tactics in place of a strategy. A tactic is a drone attack. You say, here's this organization in Afghanistan. If I kill the head of this organization, this is called the strategy of decapitation, right? If I kill the head of this organization, they are going to be wrong-footed. They're going to be knocked backward. They're going to have to fight about leadership. So they can't plan an attack against us. So let's kill them. And then 2 months later, you say the same thing, and you kill them again, the head of it. Well, what you're constantly doing, you're doing a couple of things. One is you're bringing up younger members who are often more militant and angrier. That's number one. Number two, you're killing civilians, which means that politically speaking, you're helping them. But number three, you're not adopting a strategy that's going to reduce the numbers in these groups. You're in effect helping them politically. So, the Israelis have a name for this kind of strategy, which they use in Gaza. They call it mowing the grass. Grass grows up, you mow the grass. Grass grows up, you mow the grass. The problem is you're not uprooting the grass. The grass is still there and it's always going to be there. So I think we've adopted this kind of tactic in lieu of having a broader strategy to try to lessen the flow of young men into these jihadist organizations.
That second question was whether or not, if you were Osama bin Laden, you were still alive, would you feel like you got you accomplished what you set out to?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, imagine Osama bin Laden on the day after 9/11, right, on September 12th, 2001. And you were sitting there having tea with him, and you said, I have a vision of 15 years from now. And 15 years from now, the situation will be the following. Al-Qaeda will still exist. It'll be a little larger. It'll be this worldwide terrorist network with an internet presence and all, still recruiting, all the rest of it. But there'll be a second worldwide terrorist network in 30 countries, which will have been the spawn, the product of Al-Qaeda, called the Islamic State, which will actually control territory the size of Great Britain, govern a population the size of New Zealand, and will call itself the new caliphate. So you'll have these two large organizations around the world. You'll have many other jihadist organizations. The Islamic State will be 30,000 men under arms, that many. And then you have 5 countries or 4 countries in the Middle East that are in chaos, that are targets of opportunities, of our opportunity. Yemen, Syria, Iraq. I mean, think of that. Somalia will be going to hell. So we'll have all these targets of opportunity in which the United States will be trying to hold its own as the status quo power, but we will be on the attack. What do you think of that vision, Osama, after 15 years from now? I think he would be happy with that, because I think that it represents, from their point of view, a great deal of progress. They have had a lot of setbacks as well, but the fact is that if you would describe that point of view to an American official the day after September 11th, I think there would have been an acknowledgement that this is not what we want to achieve. Of course, that American official might describe the situation now quite differently. He would say, what if in 15 years there had been no major attacks on American soil, no mass casualty attacks at all? There had been some smaller lone wolf attacks, which were very tragic and terrible, and one of which killed 50 people. But in general, the country was much more secure. And though terrorism had increased dramatically around the globe, which it has, in fact, in the United States, we are relatively safe after 15 years. Would you take it? And it's probably true that many officials after September 11th would have taken that, because they thought this was the beginning of an age of terrorism in which a lot of people would be killed.
In this year, and it could vary by 1 or 2 when we're talking, there have been about 11 people killed, Americans, in Afghanistan, and about 11 killed in Iraq.
Right.
If you were the parents of one of those 11, would it be worth us being in either one of those places now?
That's, I think, an agonizing question.
And we're frankly not paying a whole lot of attention to either situation.
I was actually going to say that it's amazing the way the attack on Mosul, has been covered as if the United States isn't directly involved. In fact, there are American forces. There are 5,000 Americans in Iraq right now. And I think, is it 9,000, 11,000 in Afghanistan? I'm not sure the exact number. But to put myself in I have young children, and the notion of losing a child in a conflict itself is agonizing to me. But to lose someone in a conflict like this, when people aren't even paying attention, and when it seems like something very far from American concerns, I think would be very, very, very painful. I think it probably wouldn't seem worth it. I think one has to tell oneself that, you know, my son or daughter was there fighting for something they believed in, and that loss was meaningful. But it just strikes me as extremely, extremely painful.
We're right between presidents, but a president in this time period calls you into the Oval Office and says, Mark Danner, what should I do about drones?
I would say, Mr. President, use them less. Realize that the decapitation strategy has its own downsides. They should be used ideally in situations in which there really is, we really do know about an imminent attack being planned. I mean, theoretically, that is when they're used, but they are now using a concept called elongated imminence. In other words, that would seem to contradict the idea of imminence. And I would say they shouldn't be the basis of our strategy in Yemen, in Pakistan, and Afghanistan. When we killed the leader of the Taliban, did we know who was going to replace him? The answer to that is no, we didn't. We simply felt that this would wrong foot them for a certain amount of time. In fact, that death may have been against American interests rather than for it. I would say long term, Mr. President, we want to develop a strategy of deterrence when it comes to these groups. Now, I know very well you think these groups are simply, they're suicide bombers, they have no vision of their own self-interest necessary to have deterrence, but in fact, you can develop a strategy of deterrence. The basis of that strategy must be, if you are not attacking our interests or even our homeland directly, we will not attack you directly. Now, that is not the whole policy, needless to say, but you have to start giving jihadist groups an interest in not attacking the United States, and to realize that you can have jihadist groups that aren't necessarily have as a policy direct attacks on the far enemy, which is the United States, rather than the near enemy, which is their immediate Muslim enemies in Cairo or Riyadh, and so on.
So what's your attitude about your classes? You've got 20-year-olds either at Bard or at UC Berkeley. Do you have a requirement to give them both sides of an argument?
I certainly have a personal requirement. And to me, you know, I often will have debates in the class, should we have tortured, for example? And I'm always delighted by the fact that very often the people on the pro-torture side tend to seem to win in the class, which I actually had a debate like that once while teaching at Bard has a program at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. And I once had a debate like that with Palestinian students when the pro-torture side was, even though the class unanimously rejected torture, the pro-torture side in the debate was judged by the rest of the class to have won the debate. And I think I try to emphasize that when it comes to policies I disagree with, these policies were one of the bewildering things and interesting things about these policies is they were almost universally put in place by very smart people who had the best interests of their country at heart. This is certainly true of policy after 9/11. And the question I like to ask is, well, why did they choose to do this? Particularly with some things that seem to be misconceived. The Iraq War is a good example of that. That there was a certain vision. I mean, as you know, I was opposed to the Iraq War before it, and then I covered it. But there was a certain vision about reordering the Middle East that was thought to be an answer to the political roots of terrorism, of jihadism. That is, if we can reorder the Middle East, produce representative governments, destroy these old autocracies, we can end this broader threat. So for everything you can say about it, and as I say, I was against it, and it was a catastrophe for American policy, among other things. For everything you can say about it, it did at least attempt to confront the political roots of jihadism. So I try to get my students to understand this. You know, if they come in hating American militarism or whatever, I like them to go out never using a term like that and understanding why certain American policies have come to be. We had a discussion the other day about the Carter Doctrine, which is really the beginning of American military policy in the Middle East, which was instituted in 1980. And they hadn't heard of this and hadn't heard of the Central Command and where this all came from. So I generally find when you get into these issues that are matters of debate among themselves and show how complicated they are, and this higher level of complexity, that they respond very positively to that. But you have to try to show both sides, I think.
So of all the people we've talked about, all the leaders, the presidents, and some we haven't talked about, if you had to put somebody at the top of the list who dealt, from your perspective, in a way when it came to war that you thought was the right way to go, who would you name?
Of the people we've talked about.
Doesn't have to be just that. I mean, but in your studying of this country and all that stuff, who would you put at the top that's done the best under the circumstances?
Boy, God bless my father. May he rest in peace. I'm going to say Truman, because Truman, given the situation he was faced with at the beginning of the Cold War, he put in place institutions that were lasting and that were designed to safeguard American interests in the broadest sense, which is to say, to bring in American allies, to create and solidify alliances, to try to ensure that hostility or aggressive tendencies wouldn't necessarily lead to war. He was a great institution builder, his administration was. Having said that, there was a lot. I mean, he promulgated the Truman Doctrine, which essentially was an ideological clarion call. George Kennan, the great diplomat and father of containment, hated the Truman Doctrine because he thought it would put politicians, it would limit their flexibility. That is, and this is what happened. We talked about the fall of China and how it haunted Lyndon Johnson. And he thought the fall of Saigon would destroy him. And that was partly the Truman Doctrine. We're called on to defend freedom wherever it is threatened. And that was certainly much more broadly ideological and capacious than it should have been. It should have been more narrowly tailored to American interests. But nonetheless, I think that he, in building institutions, he was an admirable figure. Again, having said that, he began the Cold War, and there are many downsides to his policy as well. I think FDR was a very effective president as well, obviously, in fighting the Second World War. I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm talking about people who, we're talking about 60 or 70 years ago, and I wish I could come up with somebody more recent, a statesman of more recent vintage. I think James Baker was a very able statesman, actually, sort of smart and very keen to protect American interests. And I think George H.W. Bush will probably be more highly respected as the years go on. Because in basketball, how sometimes the commentator will say, good no foul on the official part, that it was smart that the official didn't call that foul. And there's a sense in which George H.W. Bush did a lot of things that prevented catastrophes that might have happened at the end of the Cold War. So in a sense, these were negative achievements. These were dogs that didn't bark. And I think he will go down as better than we now think of him.
Our guest has been Mark Danner, who is a professor at UC Berkeley and also at Bard, written all of his life, grew up in Utica, New York, Harvard graduate. And we thank you. Your book is called Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qand.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
If you enjoyed this week's Q&A, here are some others you might like. Retired General Daniel Bolger talks about his book, Why We Lost, a general's inside account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. New York Times London Bureau Chief John Burns talks about covering military efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld on his book, Known and Unknown, about his life in public service. You can watch these anytime online and search our entire video library at CSPAN.